I had a response to an earlier video that commented on the politics of interpretation, and it's an interesting subject, but it's also a much more complex one than it appears. There tend to be two relatively simplistic approaches. Either people assume that historians are just arguing for their own political positions. You think India had a feudal period which saw people tied to the land and a restriction of money supply? Well, you're a Marxist, you would think that, wouldn't you? From this point of view, evidence doesn't really matter beyond the need to cajole it. And the opposite view, which I've heard from plenty of historians, admittedly not particularly good ones, is that proper historians don't let politics get in the way of their history. For these people, interpretation flows solely and straightforwardly from evidence. Sometimes you can even find both views wrapped up in the same short piece. This is an extract from an article in 2016 in which a journalist who doesn't know much about history talks about how historians took different views on the Brexit referendum. It's accompanied by this fun little cartoon of historians blindfolded by flags. The journalist first remarks that both sides are keen to insist that their view of history is not distorted by anything as vulgar as political prejudice, illustrating the simplistic "it's all about evidence" position. They then remark that each historian's position is probably, they don't actually know, a predictor of their vote, showing they clearly subscribe to the all interpretation is politics viewpoint. But it's not that simple. Every element of every historian's interpretation has a political aspect, but at the same time it's primarily determined by evidence, or at least the evidence the historian knows. Reducing interpretation simply to political views is as naive as assuming that there is some objective position from which a historian can avoid politics entirely. In fact, it is sufficiently complicated, there is no way to fit it into one video. So what I wanted to do was isolate just one aspect of it. Today, I will not be talking about evidence. This will just be on politics and how politics impacts interpretation, and I will focus on a single source, the Therigatha. The Therigatha is an anthology of poems associated in the Buddhist tradition of Sri Lanka, the Pali Canon, with the generation of Buddhist nuns admitted into the order by the Buddha himself. It's not entirely unique. There are other surviving collections of poems by nuns from various traditions, but nothing else quite like the Therigatha survives. The Therigatha is part of a pair with something called the Therigatha, which collects similar verses for monks. Pali Studies loves abbreviations, and those employed for these texts are usually th and thi. So when you see thi in the bottom corner and some numbers, it means I am quoting, in this case, the 33rd and 34th verses. The verses in this text are broken up by rubrics, in this case attributing the verse to the mother of a nun called Abaya. And the poems are quite variable. This one is a simple call response, in which first, a common Buddhist teaching about meditation is spoken to the nun, and then the nun responds in the first person, giving her own understanding and indicating that by this method she has become enlightened. As I said, the poems are quite variable, some in the first person, others about the nuns, and in this anthology they are organised by length, from poems of a single verse through to the longest, which contain 75 verses. And I could talk a lot more about the Therigatha. It's a really interesting text, but I promised a discussion of politics. So let's play a little game. Let's match English translations of this text against waves of feminism and the politics of women's liberation. The first English translation of the Therigatha by Rhys Davids was published in 1909 in the UK. Rhys Davids chose to publish the nuns' verses before the translation of the similar verses for monks, and 1909 is also the year that suffragette activity reached its first peak in the UK and the force feeding of hunger strikers began. Note that coincidence. Following the publication of the Therigatha, the focus of historical study on nuns tended to be on their capacity, particularly the capacity for achieving enlightenment. which is not a new debate. Buddhists and other sects have been arguing over this for thousands of years. In 1930, Horner penned a monograph on women in early Buddhism, including an entire chapter on the Therigatha, in which she remarks, "As the verses testify, were they but given the opportunity, they were as capable as men of peeling off the wrappings of the flesh, of ridding themselves of sensuality and craving, and of treading on the higher path." That remark comes just 2 years after the Representation of the People Act, which gave women in the UK the franchise on equal footing with men. And the parallel between the capacity of ancient nuns to achieve spiritual liberation and modern women to exercise the vote is obvious. For a long time, Rhys Davids' translation was the standard English text. No one felt the need to replace it until Norman published a new translation in 1971. I'll explain why in a bit, but that is the one I generally use. Right in the middle of second wave feminism and the campaign for equal pay. Norman's translation followed a notable upswing in academic interest in the text. I'll talk about the second spike you can see in that graph in the 1990s in a few moments, and it coincided with a real-world issue, the campaign within various Buddhist traditions to refound or recognise orders of nuns. So it's going to be no surprise that the third English translation, by an American this time, and aimed at a popular rather than an academic audience, coincides with third wave feminism and with that spike of papers in the 1990s. Nor should it be surprising that there is a palpable shift in the scholarship on Buddhist women after that translation. Where earlier scholars had been concerned with legalistic questions, whether women could achieve enlightenment or become nuns, newer works in the 90s and early 2000s tended to focus on why, when Buddhism seemed in a formal sense to advocate for no distinction between genders, so much of the material historians worked with was deeply misogynistic. Just as third wave feminists wrestled with why gender disparities were still obvious in societies which had largely eliminated their legal basis. Murcott's translation was the first of these in which an author published only the nuns' verses, the Therigatha and not the Therigatha, but it's not the last, and that is an important moment in the life of the text. Though the pairing of monks' and nuns' verses was probably not original and probably resulted from the process of canonization, it had been the way this text was understood as a distaff counterpart for 1500 years. In 2015, as part of the Murty Classical Library, another American, Halsey, published just the nuns' verses again. This is actually where my own work intersected. I don't do much with Pali studies. In 2016, I gave a talk about one of the poems based on an observation I had made reading Halsey's version. In that, I laid out a position I've held for a while, that the prominence of women we see at certain points in Buddhist history was a function of their own agency in forging spaces within the tradition, spaces that were frequently eroded by reactionary backlashes. I'm not the only person to have argued that. Rita Gross, in a book review in 2012, made a similar point, writing, "Time and time again, women have gained equal or nearly equal access to spiritual training and privilege, only to lose it again in a few generations." And 2015 was a reactionary moment in the United States. I don't know if this poster was a parody or actually produced by degenerate internet trolls, but the backlash against major action films, both Fury Road and The Last Jedi, for focusing their stories around female characters was very real. Ironic, since Fury Road itself featured a reactionary dystopian patriarchy as its villains. The politics that informed my talk was very much part of the popular discourse at the time. If you've never seen this game before, tracking some element of historical scholarship by contemporary events, then it would be entirely forgivable if you thought there was something special about the Therigatha, or about feminist scholarship, something particularly political about this historical evidence. There isn't. You can play this game with pretty much any historical text or problem which has received a lot of attention. The first time I did it as a student was linking a peace treaty in ancient Greece with 20th century geopolitics. It's a good game to play, It's a way of developing a self-reflective stance that gives you a stronger awareness of how your external reality imposes itself on your interpretation, which is why it is very obvious to me that my particular read on these subjects is a result of the pop culture I expose myself to. But it doesn't reduce history to politics. And the very game I just played shows us that. I could buy into the idea that all of these translators were feminists. That 2 of them were men doesn't rule that out, but I struggle to believe that they were all idiots. They presumably understood that very few people were going to read their work, and thus that using historical parallels to effect social change was going to involve a huge effort for very little gain. And there is a noticeable absence of opposing views. This all seems to be informed from a single political position within the framework of our contemporary debates. The closest thing I've come across is a single remark in a review of Horner's work on the Therigatha, which accuses her of more instinctive sympathy with those of her sex than approximation to truth, when she claims that women concentrate more intensely than men. But that is hardly an elaborate fabrication shoring up the bulwarks of the patriarchy. If the translation or interpretation of ancient historical texts could serve as powerful forces for social change, surely we would find at least a few reactionary figures producing interpretations of this text to suit their purposes. How are we to understand the game I just played if it is not historians shaping their interpretation to suit their politics? Well, when I've discussed this sort of historiographic issue, I have used a 3-part division to make sense of it. The first 2 of which are political motivation and political charge. Charge is precisely what we have just seen, that a particular interpretation has a resonance with our contemporary view of the world. It is charge we have traced in the connections between translations of the Therigatha and waves of feminism. Motivation is the term I use to describe the deliberate distortion of historical evidence to suit a purpose, which, the simplistic view suggests, is why we have charge in works at all. People are motivated to interpret in a particular way, and thus you get charge. You can read back from that charge to the motivation. But I think it's very rare for historical researchers, rather than actual politicians, to consciously manipulate their sources. Cynicism aside, I don't think it's actually that common even amongst politicians. Politics gets into our work through a process of inflection, my third category. Subtle but ubiquitous influences on us that we are often not always conscious of. And I think this happens in 2 main ways, which are by directing our questions and filling in gaps. Our political inflection suggests certain subjects to us, which is why you can't trace an argument over women's rights in the scholarship on the Therigatha. Every Western scholar I'm talking about lived in the same world, one where attitudes to gender and whether or how it affects capability, work, social position was and is obviously changing. People differ in how invested they are in that change, not in whether or not they think it is happening. And the people who are invested write about it, and the people who aren't don't. So by and large, the people who wrote about the Therigatha and the people who took the significant trouble to translate what, by all accounts, is not an easy text, are people who thought the source was important, who felt there weren't enough female voices in our history. The other way our work is inflected is in the gaps. We never really have enough data to tell us what happened. Historical reconstructions are always underdetermined. We have to make assumptions about how people think and why they do things. How do we do that? Well, we fill in the gaps from our contemporary experience. So you will recall Horner's remark that women concentrate more intensely than men. Actually, it's in the past tense in its original. And here, I return it to that original context in Horner's 1930 book. But notice how the remark arises. Despite surviving as parallel texts, the Therigatha and the Therigatha do have palpable differences, as Horner notes in this passage. And those differences need to be explained. And without much evidence to tell us why, Horner turned to her own understanding of gender differences. Thus arises political inflection from the way our questions frame the past and the manner in which our assumptions fill in gaps. These effects are, of course, no less distorting because they are subtle or unconscious. But they are of a different character than political motivation, and our inflections are not at liberty to simply disregard evidence, or at least evidence we know about. Which is, by the way, why I suspect political charge is more overt, more frequent, and more often at odds with the evidence in popular writers, politicians, or broad generalists. They don't know as much, and the less you know, the freer your questions can be, and the more gaps you have to fill with your own contemporary understanding. The more room there is, regardless of objectivity, for political inflection. It's easy to misread this, dump the motivation, and draw a direct arrow from ubiquitous inflection to charge, but that would still be a historiography 101 reading. It's still not that simple. The reality is that charge can be found in our work without inflection. Sometimes the evidence just comes with a charge. In a society where the idea that a social construction of gender has silenced women and they need to reclaim a voice, like our society, an ancient text apparently composed by women in which they record their achievement of the highest goal that literature recognises, cannot but have a political charge, one obviously not intended by its compilers over 1,000 years ago. It would be more accurate to see these three elements as constantly feeding on themselves and each other to subtly impact every aspect of our work. And 2 years ago, this would be pretty much the end of the episode. It's already well over the 10 minutes I generally aim for. But then, the first Free Women was published. Before I get to the first Free Women, let me quickly give you a bibliography. If you are interested in studying the Therigatha, you need 3 books. And here I'm talking about historical study. 2 of them are translations, by Norman in 1971 and Hallisey in 2015. I've excluded Murcott because it is not complete and it reorders and heavily annotates. Which, by the way, makes it a great translation if you're interested in what the text means to feminists and Western Buddhists now, rather than being a historian like me who wants to use it to reconstruct something thousands of years ago. But why 2 translations? Well, I don't think there is any question that Norman's is the better translation, and it has more of the academic apparatus that's useful to me, but it does not include the original text. Hallisey's, on the other hand, is a facing page translation. That is, on the left-hand page, the text is printed in Pali, and on the right-hand page, the translation is printed, which is a really useful combination to have. Oh, you do need to know one small thing. The verse count in Norman and Hallisey is different. Specifically in 3 of the poems of about 20 verses, when Norman presents something as a single verse, Hallisey splits it into 2. Which means in the later, longer poems, you need to adjust references. And it's worth noting, both of them have a different verse count to the original. How can I possibly know what the verse count was in a text we don't have? Well, that is what you need Pruitt 1998 for. Pruitt includes Norman's translation, but of the 3, it's the most complex text to read, so it's not a good way to actually get the translation. What Pruitt is translating is the commentary on the Therigatha, attributed to the 5th, 6th century monk Dharmapala. It is in Dharmapala's commentary that we get most of the biographies of the nuns that are often treated uncritically as accurate attributions. And it is because Dharmapala avoided editing the text he was working with that we know the version we have is very, very close to the one available around 500 AD, but not quite identical. At one point, the commentary cryptically tells us how many verses are in the Therigatha, and it does not come out to the number in its translation. And the simplest explanation for this is that the verse count was different. Anyway, if you're seriously interested in studying this text, you need the commentary as well as the translation, because so much of our understanding of the poems and the women they are attributed to is filtered through this 6th century monk. And this gives 3 books for the core primary source. And I would recommend at least one piece of secondary literature. There is a good article by Colette, which talks about the range of sources available on women's experience with Buddhism. as she overstates her case that the Therigatha has dominated academic discussion, but it's still a useful corrective. And if the Therigatha is the first text you come to in studying this subject, it's handy to be reminded both of the range of sources and the long period over which women played a central role in Buddhism. So, let's move to the last part of this video. In 2020, an American, Matty Weingast, published a book entitled The First Free Women. This caused quite a controversy in the Buddhist community, and given what we've discussed so far, I suspect there's going to be no surprises that the word mansplain turns up a lot. The First Free Women is not a book I would own, outside of wanting to do a video on the politics of the Therigatha, and not being able to get into libraries. It is written by and for members of the religious community, and it has no scholarly aspiration. In fact, almost exactly the opposite. A Buddhist nun, Bhikkhuni Anandabodhi, writes in the foreword, "There are several English translations, but most have been done by scholars. These academic translations of the Therigatha may be literally accurate, and with some effort the inspiring teachings can be found. For me, they miss the quality of transmission, and so remain as words spoken long ago." We will come back to why Weingast's collection speaks to a Californian American more than Dharmapala's collection, but the key point to emphasise from the beginning is that Weingast's book is not a translation. Yes, the publishers have quoted a bunch of endorsements that claim or imply this is a translation, but it's not, and it is worth being explicit about this. Weingast claims to have worked with the original Pali texts, but I doubt he is any more capable of doing so than I am. He appears to have read already existing English translations and based his poems on those. And this does not necessarily rule out calling this a translation. There are various concepts in literary translation which encompass this type of work. Ideas like relay translation, where you translate from an intermediary language, or a bridge translation, where you work from a more literal text. Bridge translations use existing translations, but are undertaken by authors with stronger skills in the language of the translation. They are intended to bridge the gap between the literal meaning of the words and the effect they had as literature in the original language. And there are a few places where this looks like a bridge translation. Take, for example, the poem attributed to Dantika, verses 48 to 50. I have placed Norman's translation side by side with Weingast's poem here, and they are basically the same. There is a line in Weingast's poem about sitting under a tree, which isn't in the original poem. It seems to be inspired by part of the biography given in the commentary. I get that believers take this stuff on faith, but seriously, the commentary biographies are not connected to the poems. This material was not passed on verbatim as a single packet for close to 1,000 years. It's the result of a lot of complicated anthologizing and editing over a long period. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Most of Weingast's poems are not bridge translations. Usually they simply borrow a theme, as in the cases of verses 25 and 26. These are voiced by a prostitute, and Weingast picks up that idea and keeps the opening remark, but dumps everything else in favour of a poem focusing on the assertion of bodily autonomy. That is a shift of theme. The original is interested in a lack of bodily autonomy only as a motivation for eliminating the cycle of rebirth. The cycle of suffering and rebirth is the central teaching it is attempting to communicate, but in Weingast's poem, all references to rebirth are eliminated, as they generally are throughout the First Free Women. Put a pin in that, we'll come back to it. And in some cases, a poem by Weingast shares nothing in common with the original, other than the title. The poem, under the rubric Rohini, verses 271 to 290, is one of the long poems in the collection. It's immediately apparent from its length, much shorter, that Weingast's poem has nothing in common. Here, I have juxtaposed 3 verses from each poem, and you will see there is no similarity of topic. Actually, there is something in common, which I will come to in a moment, but Weingast does not know that. It's purely an accident. You see, the original poem is about encouraging the general public to financially support monastics, especially through almsgiving. But that, very obviously, is not a preoccupation of modern American Buddhists. Instead, Weingast focuses on the incremental nature of modern practice, something that is not mentioned in the Therigatha. Like I said, the two do have something in common. They are both ridiculing other religious practitioners. The original is having a jab at Brahmin priests, and Weingast appears to be mocking Buddhists in the Mahayana tradition. One of the distinctive features of Mahayana texts, this is from a 4th century version of the Lotus Sutra, is the promise of easy and potentially miraculous rewards for acts of faith. In this case, that simply reciting the sutra will cause a bodhisattva to appear and console their minds. A review by a nun in November 2020 comments on how Weingast seems to silence references to rebirth or supernatural powers, and this poem, the one attributed to Rohini, is a particularly striking example of that, because it appears to critique Buddhists who have focused on such things. The range of responses to the book has been quite broad. Some have denounced it as a fraud. There have been calls to have the book banned. On the other hand, even some of those who recognise it is not a translation have been very positive about its publication. It is impossible for me to offer an opinion on how anyone should respond to this. Ultimately, a response to the poems is a subjective experience. It cannot be right or wrong. Yes, it feels odd that an American man would take it on himself to write this, but to be honest, it feels considerably ickier when I read men in the Buddhist tradition trying to explain to women why they shouldn't respond positively to the book. And yes, this particular article does that at length with no sense of irony under the term mansplaining. It feels almost like there is a section of the modern Western Buddhist community that very much wants to police the reading of nuns. And here I wish I was a better anthropologist and more skilled in oral history techniques. There is clearly an interesting study to be made out of this controversy, but it's beyond my skills to do so. If you're a putative PhD, you might want to think about this as a topic. You see, this is all quite complicated. Take this review, which remarks, the Therigatha is not just any book. It is a sacred text of the Buddhist scriptural tradition that has been faithfully preserved for 2,500 years. A sentiment that's repeated in almost all of the critical reviews I could find. But it just isn't true. I just got explaining how we know the version Dharmapala had 1,500 years ago is not quite the version we have. And the writer is ignoring the historical process that has elevated this edited anthology of minor importance to a central place in modern Western Buddhism over the 20th century. And the process Weingast's book embodies is basically how the original happened. These poems are not the literal words of any group of women. As the first translator, Caroline Rhys-Davids, remarks, no one believes that these notable adherents conversed in Pali slokas. Okay, this controversy kind of does show that lots of Buddhists do believe that, but Rhys-Davids' point is that these poems are not unfiltered access to the verbatim words of early Buddhist nuns. They are multiply anthologized, heavily edited compositions that took centuries to reach the form we know, mostly arbitrarily linked with biographies, and importantly for this case, interpreted through at least one man. And that is really why Weingast's poems speak so directly. Remember the foreword by a Buddhist nun commenting on how remote she finds what she calls academic translations? That is precisely because the academic translations are more accurately capturing the original poems than Weingast is. One of the critical reviews comments, Weingast appears to me to offer a collection of consoling, sweet poetry with little in common with the ideals of early Buddhism, seeming more in tune with Western feel-good spirituality and secular sensibilities. The review intends that as a criticism, but it is almost certainly why some Buddhists have responded so positively to the first free women. Ultimately, all of the nuns in this picture have much more in common with Weingast, a modern American man embedded in the Western Buddhist tradition, than they do with the women who wrote or to whom the verses of the Therigatha are attributed. And all of this illustrates the role of politics in our interpretation. Very few of these commentators know much about the history of the text. They don't recognise its detachment from the monk's verses and elevation from simple distaff counterpart to central spiritual text as part of a historical process in the 20th century. Nor are they familiar with the commentary or any of the historical data which makes it obvious that the framing narrative that these verses were spoken by enlightened women in the time of the Buddha absurd. And in that absence, contestations about women's voices and agency, authenticity, the importance of doctrine, and the gap between American Buddhists and the texts they venerate, in other words, the politics of our contemporary moment, fill in their understanding. Phew, this has been a long episode, and a difficult one to prepare. I worked over my thoughts on the first three women a few times. I've benefited enormously from speaking with several colleagues on it. I still feel it's a topic that requires deeper consideration. While it's well after my main interest in the Therigatha, there is no question that it reflects an important moment in the history of the text, and another moment when women have forged a space within Buddhism. But I want to come back to the question of evidence and politics. The Therigatha is a good way of looking at the politics. Yes, the evidence has changed since 1909, but it hasn't changed a lot, and that allows a freer rein for politics, whether it's through motivation or inflection, to play out. As I hope it illustrates, that is not just a matter of motivation or inflection operating as independent strands to create charge. Sometimes the charge is what impacts us. We go to the Therigatha precisely because it has become a charged text. Both within the community and academically, consider Colette's corrective article I highlighted earlier. And its charge and our interest is partly a function of female authorship. So it is sometimes hard to remember that our focus is not necessarily the reality, that there are male voices at work in the text, even if they are not what we are interested in. And that is the key point, that our politics cannot be separated from our scholarship, but the way in which it impacts interpretation is a complex issue. It is never a direct distortion, and it is no less distorting because it is subtle. If you're interested in more of my thoughts on this general problem, it is something I've tackled in print in relation to early Indian art. That appears in a volume which is entirely dedicated to the problem of how politics over the last 2 centuries has shaped art history. It's a pretty in-depth volume and quite pricey from Cambridge University Press, so I would recommend against buying it. Just find it in a library and photocopy any relevant bits. Anyway, quite enough for one day. I'll leave some links to the controversy below, and if you really want something more directly on the Therigatha, then feel free to say so in the comments below.